The point I'm trying to make here is that solidarity with Palestine has historically been situated within the global south, within indigenous movements. It wasn't opportunistic. It didn't involve money and geopolitics and power paradigms. It was genuine, it was innate, it was grassroots.
Mutual, la, mutual, la. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
What we are witnessing is the exposure of lies, that colonisation is neither benevolent or non-violent.
To understand the resistance would be to understand settler colonialism, for which mainstream media is intimately entwined with the state in this country.
Everything we do here, everything we do is really counts.
Our liberation will never be found in states, in governments, in courts, but it will be found in each other.
You're listening to the Justice for Palestine podcast.
This podcast is produced on the unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people by the Radio Reversal Collective.
In this podcast, we're aiming to create a living archive of the movement for Palestinian liberation in this city and the work that organisers, activists, artists, academics, workers, parents and everyday people are doing to challenge the genocidal project of the Israeli government.
On this episode of the podcast, we are bringing you one from the archives, a recording from the Black Palestinian Solidarity Night held in March 2023 at Yagara Hall in Magandjin, so-called Brisbane. It was organised by the Institute of Collaborative Race Research and Justice for Palestine Magandjin, with, of course, a large crew of volunteers. This discussion between Dr. Jamal Nabulsi, Dr. Amy McGuire, Dr. Ramzi Baroud, Professor Chelsea Wadigo, and opened by Dr. Shane Coggle, explores settler colonialism as a framework for understanding the experiences of Palestinian people and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people under occupation, and the relations of solidarity that are built and nourished through shared struggle in this place. The panellists also reflect on the complicity of the media and how unlearning settler colonial propaganda and building relations of struggle and solidarity requires alternative media and alternative forms of public political education and engagement. First up, we have a short discussion between producer Anna and Dr. Jamal Nabulsi, who facilitated the Black Palestinian Solidarity Night panel, to offer a bit more context for what you're about to hear. Then we'll go straight into the panel itself, which also includes a proper introduction for each of the speakers.
So I'm Jamal Nabulsi. I'm diaspora Palestinian writer and researcher who grew up mostly and lives on Yagara and Turrbal land. Yeah, I guess as a Palestinian, I mean, I was born into the struggle. Proudly, my Palestinian family comes from Nablus, which is renowned for its resistance. Just really kind of continuing in that tradition, I guess.
So we're talking on this show about the kind of deep connections between the struggle for Palestinian liberation and the ongoing struggle against all forms of colonisation and European imperialism everywhere, and particularly grounded in this place on the unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. And one of the things that I know you've been really actively involved in kind of fostering here in Magandjin, so-called Brisbane, is a strong focus on solidarity between Palestinian community here and First Nations communities. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of set of solidarity practices and the history of Blackfulla Palestinian Solidarity in this country?
Yeah, thanks so much. So there is a long history of Blackfulla Palestinian Solidarity, it spans back to decades ago, long before I was ever involved, in working to build that solidarity. I can't talk too extensively about the kind of longer history, but more recently, in Magandjin over the last few years, we've just been, really working to try and, build that Blackfulla Palestinian Solidarity through a range of different means, and just fundamentally, I guess, asking what it means to build solidarity from the fact of Indigenous sovereignty. And particularly for like us Palestinians here, trying to sort of work to understand what it means to fight for our Palestinian Indigenous sovereignty, when we're marching for Palestine over stolen land. And so, we've been working, struggling together to sort of, work through these kind of questions, whether that's through events, but also just through kind of, just turning up at protests and that kind of thing. And also, the more kind of everyday, just having conversations between communities and that kind of thing as well.
I think one of the kind of concepts and themes that comes up again and again across this series, drawn together from the archive of the struggle, not just since October, but also stretching back at least a couple of years, is the centrality of understanding settler colonialism as a set of processes that are designed to reoccupy lands already occupied, already possessed, already inhabited by Indigenous peoples, and the sort of set of processes and mechanisms through which Indigenous sovereignty is erased, disregarded, delegitimised, undermined. When you're thinking about the kind of struggle for Palestinian liberation as it's kind of grown over the last couple of months here, do you think that there's been a stronger focus on understanding Palestinians as Indigenous peoples of Palestine and Israel as a settler colonial project than there maybe has been in previous periods of Palestinian organising?
Yes, absolutely. I think we've seen a really drastic shift to people understanding more and more, Zionism and the Israeli state as a settler colonial project, and understanding Palestinians as an Indigenous people. And I think the kind of grounds for that were always there. Like, of course, even when Palestinians haven't understood themselves under the specific term Indigenous, we've always known that we belong to the land of Palestine, right? Like, the kind of grounds for it were always there. And similarly, I think Palestinians have always, from the very beginning of Zionism, even before the violent founding of the State of Israel, Palestinians understood very clearly, what Zionism was attempting to do, which was to expel them and to steal their homes and their homeland. And people made quite a clear distinction. Palestinians made a clear distinction, in those very early stages of Zionism, between, that kind of project where the colonizers come to settle the land, to take the land and eliminate the Indigenous people, and the more sort of extractive forms of colonialism. And of course, these always overlap as well, and settler colonialism is, incredibly extractive, as we have seen and continue to see. But there is that distinction that, the discipline of settler colonial studies kind of says that it coins, but something that I think Indigenous people, including Palestinians, have understood for a very long time. And it's really encouraging to see people understanding this more and more. And I think it owes a lot to the protests and other forms of public education as well. And I think it also speaks to the power of that framework and what it kind of allows us to see and understand about what's happening in Palestine.
And I think there's a strong kind of thread running through this series of podcasts of the grounds on which you find solidarity between these experiences of dispossession, of occupation, of it, like unthinkable racial violence as is unfolding at the moment in Gaza. But and this kind of thread or sense of finding solidarity through as you said before, the truth of Indigenous sovereignty. I guess for listeners who are kind of interested in why a series like this might focus so much on settler colonialism here, even in the pursuit of a deeper understanding of justice in Palestine, why do you think we have to attend to the material reality here in order to understand what's happening in inverted commas there?
Because they're so intimately connected. Like settler colonialism is a global structure, and this is something that I think that settler colonial framework also helps us to understand about Palestine as well. It also helps us to connect it to what's happening here, settler colonisation here, and the persistence of Indigenous sovereignty here as well. And yeah, settler colonialism is a global structure, and by that we don't just mean that what's happening in Palestine is similar to what's happening here, but actually seeing that these things are very directly connected. Some of Israel's colonial laws that it still deploys against Palestinians were based on similar racist laws from this colony. And right now we're seeing the Australian colony actively supporting Israel's genocide as well, through various means, the sort of moral, political support, as well as very much materially too, through their military collaborations. And so, yeah, I think starting here, first of all, it's a necessity for, when we're fighting for Indigenous sovereignty in Palestine, we have to recognise that fight here and recognise that fight necessarily starts here. And as well as the fact that, the liberation from one form of settler colonisation will never come without liberation from that structure globally. My name's Jamal Nabulsi. I'm a diaspora Palestinian, originally from Nablus, and I grew up as a settler here on Yagara and Turrbal land. So it's a real honour and a privilege to first up invite Uncle Shane Coggle up to welcome us to country.
Hello everybody, thank you very much. My name's Shane Coggill. I'm a Grumple man from Quandamuka. I must pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and all the traditional owners that have gone before. This land here is the land of the Yagara people, my great-grandmother's country. And so in saying that, then I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight for this really very, very good occasion. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Uncle Shane. I want to start off just by extending some thank yous. So massive thanks to ICRR, the Institute for Collaborative Race Research, for organising this event. In particular to Anna Soretto, who really did, pretty much all of the legwork in making it happen. Also, massive thanks to Randa Abdel Fattah, who also played a massive role in making this event happen, particularly bringing our special guest Ramzi here. And as well as to all of the amazing volunteers who helped set up, particularly to Aliyah Mansour for organising the volunteers as well, and everyone else who helped make this night happen. So I'll start by introducing our stellar panel here. We've got Professor Chelsea Wadago. Chelsea Wadago is a Mananjali and South Sea Islander woman with over 20 years of experience working within Indigenous health as a health worker and researcher. She's Professor of Indigenous Health at QUT's School of Public Health and Social Work, as well as the Executive Director of the Kurumba Institute at QUT. She's a Director at the Institute for Collaborative Race Research and a founding board member of Anala Wangara. Her debut book, Another Day in the Colony, released in November 2021, was met with critical acclaim. Let's give her a clap. That's some achievements right there. And then next to Chelsea, we've got Amy McQuire. Amy is a Dalrymple and South Sea Islander writer with 17 years experience working as a journalist across Indigenous and independent media. She's an Indigenous postdoctoral fellow at the School of Communication at QUT. Her first children's book, Daybreak, was published in 2022, and her first non-fiction book, Black Witness, will be published this year, and we're all very excited for that one. And last but not least, we have Dr. Ramzi Baroud, who's joining us tonight. And Ramzi Baroud is a US Palestinian journalist, media consultant, author, internationally syndicated columnist, and editor of the Palestine Chronicle. He's the author of 6 books and a contributor to many others. His latest volume, co-edited with Ilan Pape, is Our Vision for Liberation, Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. A round of applause for Ramzi as well. So I want to start just by basically asking each of you just sort of what brings you here tonight? What brings you to stand in solidarity, specifically with Palestinians or First Nations peoples, as the case is for each of you? So I think I want to ask you, Amy, first, because I know you've been doing a lot of solidarity work with Palestinians for a long time now, and I think quietly have become a real leader on this front, not just here but across the country. I guess I'm wondering what sort of initially sparked this solidarity. Was there a particular moment, or was it something that built more slowly? What brings you to Palestinian solidarity specifically?
I think it definitely built slowly, but it really came through just knowing Palestinians and seeing not just the violence, the overt violence. I mean, I don't think it's even hidden anymore, but seeing the just strong resistance to it from Palestinians and just seeing the similarities over here. Yeah, I think it just grew through that and just through connections and everything like that. And just seeing us as both Indigenous peoples under settler colonial societies, seeing the links, but particularly seeing the silencing tactics, because I think that still happens over here in different ways. But I previously used to work for or write for publications that were complicit in the silencing of Palestinian voices, particularly Morris Schwartz Media, so the Monthly, the Saturday Paper, all these other things, not really realising just the breadth of the censorship, you know what I mean, and just how you couldn't even speak about it. So it was very important for that advocacy to come to light, to be able to see the violence in the same way that we're seeing the violence and being able to talk about the violence in our own country. And I just didn't feel, as an Aboriginal person, I could be complicit in that silencing, writing for those sort of publications. And it's very hard for Palestinian people over here to get a voice in the media. You will not see it at all. And it's the same way that they silence Aboriginal voices. There's a very limited way that you can speak on certain issues. And if you step out of those confines, you face consequences. And there are similarities in the way Aboriginal voices as black witnesses are treated in the same way Palestinian voices are silenced and treated. So I think it was sort of a gradual thing, but really through seeing the shared resistances to that violence.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amy. And I think, you taking that moral stance and taking it so publicly has, had such a huge impact on the media landscape here as well as globally, I mean. So I'll turn to Ramzi now to ask you, because so you were in the country primarily for the Adelaide Writers' Festival. When you were approached to do some speaking events in some other cities, you mentioned that you were particularly interested in engaging with Indigenous writers and activists. So I guess I want to ask, what makes that engagement with Indigenous peoples so important to you?
Right. Thank you very much for this and for the opportunity to speak to you today, and for all the work that you guys do. I mean, you are the the real soldiers on the ground. You are the ones who are fighting this battle on a daily basis. We just come and go, but at the end of the day, without you, there is no front lines to be fought, and there is no battles to be won. So thank you for that. If I may just take us back a little bit, and do stop me. I tend not to stop on my own. So
yeah, go for it.
Just raise your hands and say, shut up, Ramzi, and stop. If you look back at the history of the Palestinian struggle, and I am talking about 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way till the mid-80s. That's when the PLO was left Lebanon after the Israeli invasion. And that's how the Palestinian resistance, in a way, became one big company with funds and millionaires and that sort of thing. And that initial act of corruption that happened to our revolution, with time translated to Oslo. We keep talking about Oslo and the Oslo peace process, and it was a bad deal for Palestinians, but we tend not to talk about the history that led us to that particular moment. But something else happened during that time, and that is language. And language particularly around the area of solidarity. If you look back at the definition that Zionism is a racist movement, that definition, which was adopted by the United Nations, I think in 1975, and was eventually rejected by the United Nations under American pressures after Oslo, I think in 1991, that definition actually did not start by Palestinians themselves. It wasn't pushed by the Arabs themselves. It was by the Africans. The African countries gathered together a few months before that resolution passed at the United Nations, and they declared that the racist apartheid regime in South Africa and other African polities is very similar to the racist Zionist regime in Palestine. And therefore, we reject this kind of racism and apartheid. A few months later, the United Nations reworked that language, and the General Assembly adopted that very definition. The point I'm trying to make here is that solidarity with Palestine has historically been situated within the global South, within indigenous movements. It wasn't opportunistic. It didn't involve money and geopolitics and power paradigms. It was genuine, it was innate, it was grassroots. Oslo changed our political thinking entirely. We were told that the only way that Palestine can ever be free if Washington would allow it. And that's where our campus began shifting. If you notice, the cities that were affiliated with the so-called peace process, from Madrid to Paris to London to Camp David to Washington, it was no longer conferences of solidarities that happening in Lagos and Brasilia and Pretoria. It was no longer something that is relatable to us from a historical point of view. At the end of the day, we lost everything. Not only we did not win any independence, and Oslo made things a lot worse, but that strategic depth that we had in the global South was basically being lost, and we were not paying any attention to it. Thanks to BDS, thanks to grassroots movements, thanks to engaged academics and intellectuals and activists, we are going back there. And here's the thing that, and I'm sorry if I am elaborating too much here, because I'm really trying to give the word solidarity actual political meaning, right? What I notice that whenever I speak, and I've spoken in over 50 countries so far, whenever I speak in the North, my language is, first of all, my position as a Palestinian, I become accused somehow. I have to explain myself. I have to justify myself. I have to talk about suicide bombings and about Hamas and about factionalism and so forth and so on. I never experienced that in the global South. And that gives me a lot of hope that when I went to Nairobi and when I went to South Africa and when I went to Chile, when I went to other countries in Asia, the conversation is not, Ramzi, explain yourself. Ramzi, why are your people doing this? Do you, Israel doesn't have a peace partner. You guys don't. No, that's not the conversation. We delve back into that historical trajectory and we continue the conversation as if this disruption of 30 years of Oslo never happened. And I think this should always be the main focus in order for solidarity to become truly meaningful.
I want to ask you, Chelsea, basically the same question.
Yeah.
Like, what brings you to stand in solidarity with Palestinians specifically? Or also feel free to, riff on anything that resonated from what Ramsey said.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Uncle Shane, for situating us here. Look, for me, I feel I'm relatively new on my journey, and I feel anyone else could possibly be sitting in the seat for this conversation. So I feel a bit thing about that. What brings me to this conversation is, I guess, as a black fella trying to make sense of the violent machinery of settler colonialism. And it's through conversations with Palestinian people and scholars that I found a shared understanding to make sense of what we deal with, what we try to live within. And, the hopelessness of the situation, and I'm, not a fan of hope necessarily, but what I find in these places is a larger home from which we can collectively strategise in and share the learnings in a way that better preserves the bodies of those who are subjected to the violence of settler colonialism going forward. And so selfishly, I'm in this conversation to learn and to better strategise. But I'm interested in solidarity in terms of the reciprocal nature of solidarity and what does that mean in a settler colonial state from whatever position we hold. And, as blackfellas here, we've seen the lack of solidarity in this place from settlers. But it's also, thinking about us as blackfellas and our obligation to be in solidarity with others that are experiencing the violence that we know too. And so I'm interested in solidarity as something that how it's reciprocal, what's our obligation, as well as how we hold people accountable to their claim of solidarity at the same time. And so, I found, coming to race and thinking about race and indigeneity, there's a limitation of sort of critical race theory in other places, and I just think some of the conversations we get to have in terms of dealing with the violence of settler colonialism, it gives me a place to think in and with, in the absence of a literature that we normally lean to that doesn't speak to this unique experience that we share.
Yeah, what you were talking about in terms of solidarity, I think really resonates also with the conversations that we were having yesterday as well on your radio show.
We went there today, Jamal.
Yeah, today, sorry, it happened today. And in terms of solidarity, and I've heard you speak before about solidarity as as a practice and as turning up, and that's something that really sort of, I think, sort of struck me and stuck with me personally. And I thought, and that it's, standing together on the front lines.
And it's like it's not a claim one can make. There's a cost and a consequence to solidarity, and being prepared to accept that. And I think that's the challenge, is people claim solidarity, but when it comes to it, will they pay the cost for that? And true solidarity is that willingness to be there when it matters, and that's where we find people falling short on solidarity, who say the right things, but when it comes to it, when we've been betrayed, still seek proximity to settlers here and to whiteness, and are not prepared to be disliked and hated in the way in which we know what that feels like. And so, I struggle with the flimsiness of solidarity at times, but also I've had to hold myself accountable to that as well. So if I stand for that, well then, when that backlash comes, of standing in that and not shying away from that, and I think that's a practice, and there's an ethics to solidarity that I think we need to be speaking about and being honest about it, and owning it, because it is an ongoing practice that we need to be talking about and reflecting on, and holding ourselves as accountable to that as we do to others, what we expect from them.
These ideas really resonate as well with the notion that you mentioned yesterday, Ramsey, of a functional solidarity, we were sort of talking a little bit about that, and I wondered if you could elaborate on this idea of functional solidarity,
solidarity means it's kind of this open term that can be defined in different ways by different people. Solidarity could potentially mean that when you go to a grocery store and you find an Israeli product, you make a conscious decision not to buy it because you want to boycott Israeli products, which is good. I mean, that makes you a political agent in a sense. There's an element of initiative, and that's important. But also solidarity means what Dr. Mads Gilbert, for example, the famous Norwegian doctor who goes to Gaza during times of war, and he gets actively involved in saving lives, and so many of them. That's solidarity too. There's solidarity in language that kind of persists within academic and intellectual spaces and doesn't really translate to anything meaningful on the ground. We're not very good at this, I think. I think we kind of, in a sense, we resolve issues within small spaces, but we constantly fail in translating it to something meaningful outside. And how do we do that? My latest book with Ilan Pape is Our Vision for Liberation, engaged Palestinian leaders and intellectuals, engaged. And that's really, for me, is the key word. The term engaged intellectual, like organic intellectual, these are Gramscian terms. That's Antonio Gramsci, the anti-fascist, scholar who pretty much perished and died in a fascist prison all these years ago. What he argued that any person is capable of playing the role of the intellectual in any space. You don't have to be a professional intellectual. You don't have to have an academic degree, and you don't have to be perceived as such by society. But you are still capable of being an intellectual if you position yourself as such. So anyone is capable of being an intellectual, but the most important and relevant intellectual is the engaged intellectual. That person who navigates his space between various groups, what Edward Said described as the insider and the outsider. And this is the kind of intellectual that we need, and that's the kind of intellectual that is capable of translating such terms as solidarity to something meaningful. And to go back to the original question, why are we here? Well, we are here because we need to explore that concept. Enough for this good feel good moments of feeling that we all sorted this out. Yes, solidarity, brothers, and then we end up leaving. But what does it mean for our brothers and sisters who sleep on the street? What does it mean for Palestinians in Hawara who had their town burned by the settlers? What does it mean for our brothers and sisters in America who are being shot point blank, mainly for being black? What does it actually mean in that regard? And if we can't figure out the answer, then our solidarity is just empty rhetoric. And if we know how to figure it out, and it's not an easy issue to figure out, because settler colonial societies, the powers that control these societies, do everything in their power to destroy and to dismantle our attempt at displaying any kind of resistance. They try to break us in every possible way. So this is not an easy process, even if we all agree that we are going to translate our solidarity to something meaningful in whichever platform we operate in as intellectuals in society or as engaged intellectuals. It could not mean anything because we are fighting against powerful forces. And it happened that we were having Greek coffee earlier today, and I was trying to explain the concept of functional solidarity. Intersectionality more or less is the same concept, but I try to translate these kind of things, break the academic hold on language so we can all relate to it. I grew up in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. Yeah, my family was like every other family. We were all poor. There were no classes in our society. We had no rich people in the refugee camp. They were all refugees, they were all poor. At times, we did not get money to buy food from school. We didn't have lunch. You don't have a school lunch. You just go and you just, because there's just not enough. When we were 6 brothers, and If everybody is getting some money for lunch, my father would go broke. So we had to allocate our money so very carefully. But once in a while, I would be given a very small amount of money, like very small, enough maybe for a piece of candy or something of that nature. And I came up with this idea with a group of friends of mine at school. We were, I think, in the 3rd grade, right? And the idea was this. Everybody seems to have a small amount of money. By itself, it did not serve any purpose. But if each one of us invests that money in buying a single item, I bought the falafel, others bought the bread, others bought the pickles and the olives, others bought the tea. Suddenly, we're all sitting on a newspaper in the schoolyard, and we're having this fancy picnic. And other kids will walk around and they would kind of give us dirty looks like we were the rich kids. We were as poor as everybody else. We just decided to invest our money in such a way that we can actually all eat. Individually, we couldn't eat. Together, we could eat. That is intersectionality. It's just the idea that you offer certain expertise and you have certain influence and certain power in your community. I have the same thing in mind. If you operate against the state machinery on your own, you will be crushed. If I operate against it, I will be crushed. But if we unify our ranks and operate against it all together, we will eventually prevail.
Absolutely. And I think when I think about solidarity in terms of traditional academic work, and I guess the thing that shoots me the most is the idea that solidarity is having the most sophisticated take on someone else's struggle and becoming the knower of it. And that's not what that is, but sadly that is what happens in this place. And, it was Saeed that gave me the ability to see a freedom in being the exiled academic, the marginalised scholar, and the joy, the beauty, the freedom that comes with doing things on your own terms, but finding community to do that with. Hence ICRR and the community that we're building is to find new ways to do the work. And there is important intellectual work to be done, and it's not the domain of academics within universities. It's everybody, like we're all theorising about this place, and to open up that space for us to collectively strategise and just even, there's only so much that the scholar can do, there are limitations to that. And I just think about the role of the journalist, and I think the work that gets to do with Amy and the different, how we work together, but in different ways to influence and shape thinking and take people, bring people in, and make the understanding of this structure that we're fighting against, it has to be accessible to the people who are experiencing the struggle. What's the point of it if we don't?
I mean, I was just even reflecting on reading your work in the Palestinian Chronicle, because my thing is how we build up some sort of insurgent media or some sort of Indigenous media or some sort of sovereign media. And so when I was reading your work, you're directly speaking back to violence that you're not supposed to name, that you're supposed to take as normalised. And, when you're doing journalism, you're supposed to be objective. Like there's all these core journalistic principles and news values that ultimately work against what you are trying to do. There are certain values based on certain people's lives that place people above, some bodies above others. And so we have to think of new ways of doing journalism that breaks through that. And so when I was reading some of your articles, that's what I saw, you know what I mean? And so I think it's what we can learn from other people as well in building our own sovereign media to speak back to violence that is so often concealed. Yeah, and I think we can take that from so many different places, not just the academy, journalism, art, so many other different arenas.
I mean, you're all sort of in different ways so actively involved in the media, and yeah, as you were talking about, Amy, Palestinians and First Nations here are so misrepresented, vilified in mainstream media, ultimately to justify violence against these two communities and to ultimately steal their land. And so I'm wondering, and you very much touched on this as well, Amy, already, but wondering if we can dig further into basically what role solidarity can play in this fight that you're talking about, Amy, against these misrepresentations.
I remember a few years ago now when Eurovision was in Tel Aviv, and our representative for that year was Jessica Mauboy. And so we felt very strongly about her going over to perform at Eurovision, which obviously is a case of, propaganda and whitewashing. So we decided to write Open Letter. It was co-authored by 3 Aboriginal writers, 3 Palestinian Australian writers and 3 Jewish Australian writers. So we went to great lengths to try and get this letter published strategically, to have all those people represented. But of course we couldn't get it published. We ended up getting it published in New Matilda. But the letter wasn't even calling out Jessica Mauboy. It was an attempt to show what her presence at Eurovision meant in the wider scheme of things. But I think there are just so few avenues to contest a lot of the language that Ramsey talks about. And you only really can do it in independent media or black media. There is no other way. And we've seen that in Fairfax, we've seen that in News Limited just over the past few weeks. We see that continually with Black Ink, with The Monthly, with the Saturday paper. And so we have to circumvent that. But that's something that blackfellas have been doing for a very long time over here, because the media is complicit in the violence that is being continually perpetrated on blackfellas over here, and we'd see that continually. And you sit in the inquest, you sit in the court, you sit in community, and you see all of this language used to obscure the sheer brutality of what is happening to Aboriginal people. And Chelsea will talk about it as well. The core aspiration of the settler colony is to eliminate black presence from black lands, and that's what's happening over in Palestine as well, eliminating Indigenous presence, disappearing them into jails. Gaza's the largest open-air prison in the world, starving them of resources. There are so many ways, and you're not supposed to speak back to that violence, and the media is complicit in concealing that violence. And so our work over here has been actively finding ways to contest it, for our media to be used fundamentally as a tool for our communities, as a weapon for our communities. It's not objective, it's not there to promote your career, it's fundamentally to be used for those on the front line. And that's a totally different aspiration from the majority of the mainstream media today. Yeah, so I think that
one of the challenges in terms of, just for both of you, I think, in terms of making visible the violence. And I'm reminded of Fiona Foley's work as an artist who talks about the challenge of representing violence without reproducing it. And I'm just curious about how you both navigate, making visible the violence and the ethics around how you navigate that decision making. Because I think in our context here, you want to make visible the violence, and you see families who have to go through the courts to get CCTV footage released of the death of their loved ones in custody. And then as a political strategy, the effectiveness of that in showing our wounds, what change does that affect change, or what's the function of it, and what does it do to ourselves in that? So I'm just really curious about how you navigate representing violence and bringing attention to the violence.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the big issues in relation to reporting of Aboriginal affairs over the past decades. It's just that we continually see these images of the brutalisation of black bodies, of black women, of black children, of black men, particularly in the justice system, but even outside of the justice system. And it fails to, when these images come out, they fail to shock Australia, or if it shocks Australia, it's only for the next probably a week. It fails to lead to any concerted action. And I started to look particularly around the deaths and disappearances of Aboriginal women particularly, but the way that they were spoken about that denied them justice in any form, but also in the way that the courts and the media continually reproduced that violence through representational violence, through failing to see them as people but always seeing them predominantly from the wounds of their bodies, only speaking of them as body parts or wounds, and ways that denied them full personhood, and ways that failed to continue to deliver justice in the ways that Aboriginal people wanted justice. And that's been continual from the days of the frontier to now, in that we have all of these anonymous tales of Aboriginal people who have been killed or been disappeared, and there is no justice for any of them. And the media has been so complicit in that continual brutalisation. And so I felt that we needed a way to speak back to that violence in ways that continually did not bury the women again or perpetrate those wounds in those same ways. Because when we show those images of trauma, it does not do anything except feed this insatiable appetite that white Australia has, that's always fed upon the brutalisation of black bodies, because that's the beginning of the colony. And so I felt we needed a different way to speak to this. And I started to look into particularly an amazing Aboriginal Canadian academic called Leanne Bittasamoki Simpson, who speaks of presencing and speaking back to this violence through acts of presence. I started to see it as not particularly humanisation, because when media humanises Aboriginal people, it's often to make them closer to what they seem as human, which is always closer to whiteness. So you're always humanised in relation to traits that are most palatable to white people. And that obscures many things. It obscures a lot of levels of violence that Aboriginal women are blamed for when they could be resistant. You know, you're resisting violence, but then you're framed as being violent yourself. And so I felt we needed a different way to speak to these stories that continually just didn't see us as bodies that are open for violation, but instead of people who have a right to live free of violence. You know, I felt like white Australia is not ready to hear those stories, and so we must tell those stories, not particularly for white Australia, but to be given back to the families, to be given back to communities, because right now we do have an issue in this country. We have a crisis where Aboriginal women, Aboriginal children and men are being funneled into really violent systems that are electorally popular, which we see in Queensland, particularly around the Aboriginal children and the targeting of Aboriginal children, the opening up of new child jails. And that is something that is sustaining the state of Queensland, these harsh law and order policies. And it is sustained by a lot of these images that you see of these violent Aboriginal children. They're just children, you know what I mean? And so I felt we really needed... The media had such a huge responsibility, but the more I looked at the media, I felt like they were never going to be up to that task at all, the mainstream media. And then I started to look at, it's always been, the mainstream media in this country has always been a tool of imperialism. It's always been a tool of colonialism. If you look back into the archive, even the most progressive voices were incredibly racist, as we know. And I don't think they should be given any excuses because they are of their time. You know, they are working towards what we know now is the invasion of this country and the continual invasion of this country. This is happening in real time in Palestine. And so speaking back to that through independent media, through sovereign media, through different forms of media, and I often talk, we're in a time of crisis, climate crisis, and our media has utterly failed everyone. And so why are we still looking to reform the media? Why are we still looking to have a place in the mainstream media? We need to have a place outside of that media to be able to inform our communities, to start building these links, to start speaking back to the violence that is so normalised that people take it as a given. You know, you only have to look at what's happening right now in this state of Queensland, a state of disappearance where they're continually wanting to brutalise the most vulnerable people, and everyone is okay with it. You know what I mean? I feel like the mainstream media as a whole is completely just... It can't be... You can't reform it. You can't get in there and change it. You literally just can't. You're working in this... It's no different from any other colonial apparatus in this country. You know, the police inform the media inform the police. Regardless if you have these stories of the racist and the gendered violence of police in the media, they still go back and use the police as the primary informants. They're still using the politicians as the primary informants. They don't interrogate anything. You know what I mean? And they normalise those really horrific logics which you sit and you look at and you think, how on earth could we think that this is okay?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So many important issues have been raised, and I'm going to try to so very quickly touch on that. But I'm going to just start with this issue because as I have, I served as a full-time journalist when I was 16 years old in Gaza, in the camp, and my job was to chase after ambulances where Palestinians were shot and killed, and try to get their names and get quotes from their, bereaved families in the hospital. It wasn't the best job in the world, and it's certainly the least comfortable for a 16-year-old child having to do it. And since then, I haven't stopped. I mean, I kind of deal with it in a different way, different platforms, different representations, but essentially, it's the same thing. We are still, talking about the 6 who were killed in Jenin yesterday, and the 11 who were killed in Nablus last week, and those who killed in Shafat before that, and so forth. So the basic element of the discussion is still people being killed. And it's quite worrying because Because at the end of the day, when that becomes us, when death becomes us, when destruction becomes us, when burning and ethnic cleansing, and expropriation of land and all of that becomes us, you start wondering sometimes, like, do you lose sight of who you actually are? It's like you kind of allow your enemy to define you, even though you are fighting against that very definition, but you start internalizing it over time as well. And as a journalist, I have tried to challenge that by, like, if you go to the Palestine Chronicle, you're going to find news about the 11 killed and the 6th and the 7th and the 3 and the 4 and the 5. But you will also, if you go to the Palestine Chronicle today, you're going to talk about the achievements of Palestinian women on International Women's Day. You are going to see human developments. You are going to see children doing karate in Gaza. You're going to see a Palestinian doctor who won an award, and so forth and so on. So, our societies, believe it or not, actually do exist between Israeli wars. We don't just drop everything and just wait for Israel to come back and kill some more. We do exist. In fact, we thrive in many ways. I mean, the artistic movement in Palestine is absolutely powerful. Our films win international awards. Our books, our authors, our poets, our rap artists, and I know this is your area of research, Jamal, we do exist, and we have to celebrate that. Not as a way of deflecting or like, oh, forget about, let's talk about happy things for change. No, because they are both connected. They try to deprive us of life and land and freedom, and we insist on our rights to live on our land in freedom. Palestinian women, I mean, since we're talking about the International Women's Day, 19.6%, I think I'm correct with this, 19.6% of all Palestinian adult women have university degrees and higher. This is happening within the framework of colonialism and military occupation. Imagine if we didn't have these restrictions imposed. And by the way, that is like one of the highest percentage in the entire MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. That is something worth celebrating. That is something that alienates the power of our communities as collectives to fight back. Fighting back is not about firing rockets. Fighting back is not someone with a knife or a dagger or a gun. Fighting back is that everyday resilience, insistence on education. We always complain about the Israeli checkpoints, preventing kids from reaching their schools, preventing people from going to work. But we don't talk about the fact, still, despite the fact that this happens every single day, you still have tens of thousands of people who stand on these checkpoints insisting that they want to go to school, they want to harvest their olives, they want to live their lives. That insistence is we are making their life very difficult as well. They are making our lives very difficult, but we refuse to go away. We refuse to go away, and not just we exist, existence is resistance. Yeah, but for Palestinians, it's not just existence. It's existence in a whole different way. Just really one last quick story. When I went to Gaza a few years ago, I kind of internalized this whole, oh, poor Palestinians, the war and all of this. And so I go with this deep sadness. It's been many years since I went to Gaza, and the news that we are living this tragedy from far away without being part of the community, the everyday community. So I go and I'm sitting in an internet cafe somewhere in the Rimal neighborhood in Gaza City, and then I look at all the posters. There's all the posters in the streets, pictures of entire families, and I assume that these are the people who were killed in the last war and those people killed in the previous war. But then I start kind of looking closer, and I start realizing, no, some of them were killed in previous wars, but some of them are new graduates, families congratulating other families for, Alf Mabruk, 1,000 congratulations for the graduation of your son from university, or picture of couples who just got married, and people who went to do pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia and they came back. And then I looked at this mosaic, this mix of tragedy and hope at the exact same time. Pictures of families that died and pictures of newborn on top of one another. and I'm just trying to make sense out of it. I was born in Gaza, but sometimes these things escape you. That's the secret of continuity of Palestinian society. And then I hear this big ruckus coming from somewhere, loud music. And then there's this massive caravan of cars, people going to a wedding hall, from a refugee camp to a different refugee camp. We're talking about months after one of the most destructive wars, right? And they wouldn't wait until they got to the wedding hall to celebrate. They were all perched on top of the trucks. Even the music band was on the back of this big truck, all playing their music and people dancing in the streets. And I was like, yeah, that's what now this is the Gaza I remember. It is that mix. They come and they blow things up and white phosphorus and children and people get buried. And then the following day, we go back to our mosques and churches and we pray. We go to our markets and we bargain. We go to our schools and we celebrate and we carry on with our plans as if nothing has happened. We refuse to internalize and be defined by our victimhood and by their wars. And that's, I think, is the secret of our society. And that's why we keep going 75 years into this ongoing genocide, and yet we refuse to be defeated or to surrender under any circumstance.
Did you want to add anything to that, Chelsea?
Yeah, and I think it's just from that yarn yesterday that I think people forget also the violence of the concessions that need to be made in that appeal to have someone speak on your behalf and not believing in yourself. And the freedom and joy that comes from building on your own terms, because you suddenly realise how much labour you're exhausting in an appeal to exist in those spaces or to carve out space in those spaces, and that you actually don't get time to do the work with your own people because you're constantly in this appeal. I think that's, it took me a while to arrive at that. And this, I guess everything you said about the media is the same for the academy. That why do we believe academic institutions would do any better? They're built on stolen land and profit from that. And so coming to it, and I think, if you've been to ICRR, it's a small house, it's just this little house, but it is about that building in places that are not predicated upon you not existing. And it may be the hard road and the long road, and it's it keeps you from certain tables where we believe power resides, but that thinking means you forget your own fucking power, and we can't forget that. And so that's just in that yarn with you. I really relate to that, and giving up on the hope that somehow our humanity will be seen and recognised, and realising and standing our own power. And Uncle Shane's sitting here and was someone who helped me arrive at that place of knowing our power. And I think when we talk about solidarity through sovereignty, or when we remember who we are and where we come from and work from that basis, we are so more powerful and so more effective. And not just in our time, but for those that follow for generations to come. Because that's our responsibility in this time, is for those that follow.
Thank you.
So yeah, just put your hand up if you have a question, and Medina will come over to you, and feel free to ask your question to a specific person or to the panel in general.
Hi, thank you for coming here, and thank you for letting us ask questions. The system, the white man system, call it what you will, in response to this oppression, comes up with offers. An example would be here in Australia, you've got the Voice, and there could be a parallel or not with the offer made to the Palestinians. How do you, Ramsey, and how do you, Amy, and the other speaker, see these offers? Are they enough? Are they a pathway to something better? How do you evaluate them? That's my question. Thanks.
My answer is going to be very quick. so you guys can elaborate. We've never been offered anything, so I'm not really sure. I mean, if the references to Oslo and all of that, not only we were not really offered anything, we lost a lot more since, what was promoted in the media as some kind of an offer. If you guys remember when the Camp David talks were taking place and Yasser Arafat, Ehud Barak, and Bill Clinton, were negotiating, some sort of a settlement. And then the media kept saying that Yasser Arafat rejected a generous offer. It was like, and that was like this, the buzzword, the generous offer. People were like, you Palestinians are so ungrateful. And at the end of the day, there was actually no offer, generous or otherwise, and the whole thing was a media ploy. But it registered with millions of people that Palestinians were the ones who are responsible for the end of the peace process because they rejected. So if the term offer is ever involved in the Palestinian discourse, it's always a media ploy, it's a lie, it's deception. No offers have been made, and honestly, I don't think Palestinian freedom will ever be exacted through offers anyway. I think it is just a process, an organic process of the people's resistance themselves. And eventually we will arrive at that moment when we feel that whatever situation we have created through our resistance is going to guarantee what we perceive to be the minimal amount of rights that we are fighting for, and only then we can start engaging with that new reality.
I mean, there's always the voice question. I think about the voice and also treaty here in the state of Queensland, a supposed treaty, while, bringing in new laws to lock up black kids and target black kids specifically. We're told treaties about renegotiating the relationship between the state government and blackfellas, yet we've seen it's reinforced in real time right now. So it's not an offer. It feels like these processes are being used in a way that we forget who we are and where we come from, whose land we're on, to make settlers feel more comfortable about occupying stolen land and giving nothing, while making us feel like ungrateful natives. The fact that we're being offered a supposed voice of which we don't get to decide whether we have it or not, and there's no actual sense that it comes with any actual power. It has a whole native title vibe about it. And this is, I guess, the violence of this place is the way in which it's disguised, that the state can present itself as somehow a solution to the problem it represents. And that's where, as blackfellas, we have to know the truth and remember who we are and where we come from and whose land it is and who should decide and on what terms, and not buy into the idea that that's some offer or a gift, because it isn't.
And I just add to what Chelsea just said, it's being framed as this once-in-a-lifetime chance, which is crazy because when this whole debate began, it was about how we protect mob from racial discrimination, because currently we have a racist constitution. It got watered down to such an extent that it became something that could pass at a referendum that the Australian people would be proud of. And so it's always been something that's been sold to the rest of Australia at the expense of Black Australia, who at the heart want to talk about these issues that are currently happening in our communities. The fact we do not have any protection against racial violence, gendered, sexist violence, and we're seeing it right now. And so, you see even Anastasia Palaszczuk putting up a video about International Women's Day and maintaining the rage while at the same time she's locking up black kids. At the same time we have Aboriginal women who are still disappeared in this state where the coroner's court and, laying the groundwork for impunity. It doesn't really give us any protection, you know what I mean? It's just been watered down so that white Australia can have its feel-good moment. And it will be really scary as we go into a referendum and we see the inevitable racist dialogue that is going to be drummed up in a referendum. So it's hard to see how it is an offering, as you say, or it is a gift.
And Yeah, we have race discrimination legislation, but it gets suspended at any given time. And even when blackfellas use that, the state will still come for you for costs when you lodge those claims.
This is a general question for everyone on the panel. I'm curious to know, when it comes to these movements, what role do white allies play?
Why are you looking at me for? I don't know, use your powers for good instead of evil. I mean, I get slack for this question because I don't really care anymore, to be honest. We've been trained to be of service to white fellas, even in our own struggle. And so I found a freedom in not investing in that, and really about how do we build our own black collectives wherever we find them, because that's where the power lies. It's not with white people. I mean, I know they like to think that, and we've bought into that, but we have, I'm just not exhausting my labour anymore on teaching white people how to be better settlers. If there was a manual, it would have been written by now and they would have read it and followed it. I think, that's... I think white people need to teach white people how to be better allies and pull your own people in line.
Would you like to address him? No comments from Amy as well. So this is really interesting because for us Palestinians we do need all kind of alliances, and I wouldn't put it that way. I wouldn't even use the term white allies. I mean, the term white people is relatively, from a historical point of view, is a new term, like mid 17th century, and the term was created. Prior to that, people were Germans and French and Polish and Russian. They were not white. White was a concept that was created to alienate power relations, especially during the slavery of black people in the United States. In order for us to keep the slaves in their place, we needed to create a power paradigm in which there are people who are doing the domination and another group that is being dominated. Therefore, the white people rose out of the misery of black people. And if you ask me, what do you expect from these white people? Well, I just told you, it's a power relations, it's about dominance. What do I need from someone who defines his very existence based on dominating me? I have nothing to do with that person. So I would widen that definition, and I say people from all over the world. First of all, indigenous peoples, people who went through the process of national liberation, anti-colonial movements all over the world. These are the first line of alliances. Because number one, they completely relate to what you have been through, and they know that by our freedom, I mean, when Nelson Mandela said, the freedom of our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians, he was not writing poetry. He understood that freedom cannot be sectionalized, and it's either we are all free at the same time or no one of us is free, and that's true. So that's our first line of defense. But we also want to delegitimize Israel internationally. I am keen on delegitimizing Israel in France and Spain and Canada as well, because that's where Israel gets its power, its money. When Netanyahu says things like they are trying to delegitimize the state of Israel in reference to the BDS movement, he's right. For once in his life, he's actually telling the truth, right? We are trying to, but we're not trying to delegitimize Israel as the state of the Jewish people. We are trying to delegitimize Israel as an apartheid racist regime. And that delegitimization cannot happen without the solidarity of everyone, everywhere, right? And that's why we have to work with everyone, but with the understanding that solidarity does not mean replacement. These conferences that have always been held in the name of Palestine and Europe, and sometimes you don't find a single Palestinian on the panel. We can't go through that again. That's not solidarity. That's another way of manufacturing dominance, but in a different mechanism. It's about control, and we can't allow that to happen. So solidarity means you stand by my side. Give me the platform, give me the space, and more importantly, please do not teach me how to resist. Please. Who was that? Rafif, the Palestinian poet Rafif Ziada, who wrote, "We teach life, sir. We teach resistance." We've been doing this for a century. We know how to resist. In 1936, Palestinians carried out a general strike that extended for 6 months. And that led to a rebellion that lasted for 3 years. Imagine the political consciousness of a group of people who were called fallahin, peasants. They didn't know how to read or write, but they had enough political consciousness that they would persist despite of British violence and Zionist violence, and they would carry on with that kind of mobilization at a mass scale. We don't need anybody to come and say, don't use violence, do this, why are Hamas... No, this is not your business. That's our own fight. We are gonna fight for that, and we will win, but your responsibility is to look at the action of your own governments, right? The taxes that are collected on your behalf, and a portion of these taxes pays for the weapons and the guns and the bullets that kill our children. That's your responsibility. And if you, being a true ally, you will work very actively to reverse this devastating mechanism that keeps feeding Israel with all these weapons and with all this money. We need that kind of solidarity because that's meaningful solidarity, but not a solidarity of imposition, a power relations and dominance once more.
You've been listening to the Justice for Palestine Magandjin podcast,
produced by the Radio Reversal Collective.
Huge thanks to 4ZZZ here in so-called Brisbane for providing the space and resources for us to pull together this series.
If you're interested in amplifying the struggle for justice for Palestine through your own platforms, and you'd like to access the Justice for Palestine Magandjin audio archive, please let us know via our Substack, where you'll also find details about how to get involved in the struggle for Palestinian liberation right here in Magandjin.